Open in app. The Sovereignty Dowry Part 2. How sovereignty is architected before the child draws first breath. MXTMAK Pirate 1 of EJTSUNAMIX. May 4, 2026. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 2. The Jurisdictional Plays. How sovereignty is architected before the child draws first breath. 6. The Flag-State Gambit. Microstates, maritime platforms, and the art of choosing which law applies before the courts can choose for you. Law is not a wall. It is a surface. A wall stops movement. A surface redirects it, channels it, concentrates it, determines which forces accumulate and which dissipate. The wall is a binary proposition. You are inside or you are outside, contained or excluded. The surface is a more interesting problem. It has texture. It has angles. It has points where the force encounters resistance and points where the force, meeting a favorable geometry, moves faster than it moved in open space. The families who understood law as a surface built differently from the families who understood it as a wall. The wall builders sought protection. They wanted to be inside a structure strong enough to repel external claim. They hired lawyers who specialized in defense, in constructing arguments for why the claim was invalid, why the jurisdiction lacked standing, why the statute did not apply. This was expensive, slow, and fundamentally reactive. The wall strategy assumed that the adversary would identify the target, construct the claim, and initiate the proceeding, and that the target's job was to resist successfully. The surface builders sought something else entirely. Not resistance. Geometry. The adversary's claim in the surface model was a force. Like all forces, it traveled in straight lines unless redirected. The surface builder's task was not to stop the force, but to ensure that the geometry of the legal landscape through which the force traveled never delivered it to the target. The claim would be filed. The force would be applied. The jurisdictional surface would redirect it into a gap, into an overlap between frameworks that produced mutual cancellation rather than enforcement, into a position that existed within the technical reach of one authority and the practical reach of none. The Flag-State Gambit was not the most sophisticated jurisdictional tool the ultra-sovereign families employed. It was the most elegant. The principle of flag-state jurisdiction is among the oldest continuous legal doctrines still in operational use. Its origins predate the nation-state in its modern form. Before there were passports, before there were standardized border controls, before there were bilateral treaties governing the extradition of persons who had moved from one authority's reach to another, there were ships. And ships presented a problem that land-based legal frameworks were structurally unable to solve. A ship on the open ocean was sovereign territory belonging to no coastal nation. But it was also not lawless, or not entirely, not most of the time, because lawlessness on a vessel created problems that the vessel's commercial purpose could not survive. The solution that emerged over centuries of maritime practice and eventually formal codification was elegant in its simplicity. The vessel carries the law of its flag. Wherever it sails, whatever waters it transits, whatever disputes arise aboard it, the applicable legal framework is the framework of the nation whose flag it flies. The flag state assumes jurisdiction. The flag state's law governs. This was clean doctrine when ships flew the flags of serious nations with robust legal systems and genuine administrative capacity to exercise the jurisdiction they had nominally assumed. It became considerably more interesting when the flag registry market developed. The flag registry market emerged because maritime nations discovered that flag registration was a revenue source requiring almost no infrastructure investment. A nation needed a registry office which could be a desk, a clerk, and a fee schedule. It needed a flag which it already had. It needed a legal framework for vessels under its flag, which could be whatever it chose, as long as it satisfied the minimum requirements of the international maritime conventions to which it was a signatory, and sometimes not even those. The small nations that entered this market in the latter half of the 20th century were not, in the main, motivated by a sophisticated theory of jurisdictional arbitrage. They were motivated by revenue. But revenue motivation and jurisdictional utility are not mutually exclusive. The result, by the time the post-scarcity era produced the ultra-sovereign families as a distinct cohort with specific jurisdictional needs, was an extraordinarily heterogeneous global registry landscape. Flags were available from nations whose legal systems ranged from highly developed to nominally existent. Registration requirements ranged from rigorous to ceremonial. Administrative capacity to exercise actual jurisdiction over flagged vessels ranged from comprehensive to theoretical. And it was in the gap between nominal jurisdiction and functional jurisdiction that the surface builders found their geometry. The gambit was not about finding the most permissive registry. Permissiveness was the crude version, the approach of the entity that wanted to operate without oversight because its operations could not survive oversight. This attracted exactly the kind of international attention that the ultra-sovereign families were most determined to avoid. Attention was the enemy. The gambit was about finding the most specifically calibrated registry, calibrated for the particular gap the family needed to exist within. For birth events, the calibration was precise. The required characteristics of the flag state were not primarily about permissiveness toward the birth itself. The birth, under almost any registry framework, would simply occur. The vessel's log would record it, the attending physician would document it, and the resulting child would be a biological fact regardless of what any administrative system chose to do with that fact. The calibration was about what happened afterward. Specifically, what the flag state's framework produced or failed to produce, in terms of records that would persist in accessible form and attach to the child's legal identity. The ideal flag state for a birth event had several characteristics that did not naturally co-occur in major maritime nations, and therefore required identification in the secondary and tertiary registry market. It had a birth registration statute because the complete absence of a statute created a different kind of legal problem, the problem of an event that had no legal category whatsoever, which attracted its own form of scrutiny. But the statute's implementation pathway was functionally non-operational. The form existed. The office to which the form would be submitted had, for reasons of administrative reorganization, budget reduction, or simple institutional entropy, ceased to function as a submission destination. The statute was real. The record was not created. The jurisdiction was nominal. The claim it could make on the child was therefore nominal. A nominal claim, unlike an actual claim, did not follow the child through every subsequent system they entered. It did not appear in the databases that border authorities queried, or the identity verification systems that financial institutions required, or the legal proceedings that family members might eventually initiate. A nominal claim in a world built on database queries was no claim at all. The families who used this approach did not use it uniformly. The Flag-State Gambit was one element of the jurisdictional layer, and the jurisdictional layer was one element of the stack. The specific gambit deployed depended on the specific gap the family needed, and the specific gap depended on the specific threat model the family had identified. Some families needed primarily the birth record gap, the absence of an automatic identity enrollment that would trigger the default settings of the jurisdiction, most likely to assert a claim on the child's estate. Others needed the administrative gap properties of a specific flag state because those properties interacted favorably with a separate legal structure they had already established in a different jurisdiction, producing, at the intersection of the two frameworks, a position that neither framework individually provided. Still others used the Flag-State Gambit not for birth events at all, but for asset structures, vehicles and platforms that held components of the sovereignty stack, in a form that no single national authority could claim fell within its regulatory perimeter. The energy infrastructure that powered the offshore platforms, the data storage nodes that held elements of the key architecture, the clinical facilities that conducted the genomic work without creating records, attached to the client's primary legal identity. All of these could be housed in flag state structures calibrated for the specific jurisdictional gap each required. The gambit was not one move. It was a family of moves sharing a common structural logic. Identify the claim. Map the legal surface through which the claim would travel to reach its target. Find the geometry that prevents delivery. Position accordingly. Dario Escobarmen had spent 14 years as a maritime lawyer before he began advising the ultra-sovereign families. His previous practice had been conventional: disputes between shipping companies, flag state compliance, the tedious but lucrative work of navigating the interaction between international maritime conventions and the domestic law of nations that had signed them with varying degrees of sincerity. He had developed through this work a map. Not a literal map, though he maintained several of those, updated quarterly, tracking the administrative capacity of the major and minor registry states across the dimensions that mattered for his practice. A conceptual map. A topology of jurisdictional space that showed not where law was strong or weak in the abstract, but where specific types of claims encountered specific types of obstacles in their travel toward specific types of targets. He had begun building this map for conventional commercial purposes, understanding which registry framework minimized a shipping company's liability exposure in which categories of dispute. He had not anticipated that the map's most valuable application would be in a domain that did not yet exist when he began building it: the domain of sovereign family architecture. His introduction to the cohort came through a referral from a client he had helped navigate a Flag-State dispute whose resolution had required him to engage, more deeply than any prior matter had required, with the question of what a Flag-State's jurisdiction actually meant in practice as opposed to in statute. The answer, he had discovered, was considerably less than the statute implied, in a considerable number of cases, if the right questions were asked of the right administrative records before the adversarial proceeding began. The client had been pleased. The client's associate, a woman who described herself vaguely as an architect, had been extremely interested. 3 months later, Dario was sitting across from her in a meeting whose agenda was not commercial maritime law in any recognizable sense. She wanted to know, she said, which flag states had birth registration statutes with non-operational implementation pathways, and what other jurisdictional properties those states tended to have in adjacent areas of their administrative code, and whether those properties interacted in any way he could identify with the legal frameworks of a list of nations she placed in front of him. Dario looked at the list. He looked at the woman. He said, "What are you building?" She told him. "Not everything." "Enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The answer to your first question is 11. To your second, the adjacent properties cluster in 2 groups, and I can describe both. To your third, the interactions are more interesting than I would have predicted before you asked." He paused. "How long do you have?" She said, as long as it took to do it correctly. Dario had learned, in 14 years of maritime practice, to recognize clients who understood the difference between a question and the right question. She had asked the right question. He picked up his pen. The gambit, in practice, was never a single instrument. This was its central discipline, the discipline that separated the families who used it well from the families who used it partially and created, through the partiality, problems that were harder to solve than the original problem would have been. A single flag state registration that provided a birth record gap, standing alone, produced a child whose legal status was genuinely ambiguous. This ambiguity was not, by itself, useful. Ambiguity attracts attention. Courts, administrative bodies, and the various institutions that process identity documents all have established procedures for handling cases of ambiguous status, procedures that involve inquiry, investigation, and the eventual assignment of a status the subject may not have chosen. The gambit required complementary architecture, a second jurisdictional element that provided the child with a positive legal identity, not through the birth event, but through a subsequent deliberate process that was itself the product of selection rather than assignment. A citizenship or legal residency, acquired through legitimate investment or treaty mechanisms, in a jurisdiction whose property law, inheritance statutes, and enforcement cooperation posture had been carefully evaluated against the family's specific requirements. This second element was not the gap. It was the destination. The Flag-State gap created the space between enrollment and identity. The deliberately selected citizenship filled that space with something chosen. The child who had been born into the Flag-State gap, and then acquired identity through deliberate selection, had not been denied legal existence. They had been given the rarest form of it, legal existence on their own terms, not assigned by the accident of birth location, not inherited from the default settings of a jurisdiction that had never been evaluated for fitness, designed, selected with the same rigor applied to the genomic work, the data architecture, the key structure, the energy infrastructure, with the same question driving every decision. Not what is the default here? What do we actually want? And what is the cleanest path to it? The families who failed at the Flag-State gambit failed in a consistent pattern. Not at the gambit itself. The flag state element was, in the hands of advisors like DOWRY, technically reliable. They failed at the complementary architecture. Specifically, they failed at the transition. The gap between the birth event and the acquisition of deliberate identity was a period of genuine exposure. The child existed. The child had no formal legal identity recognized by any functional administrative system. And the world, unlike the family's legal advisors, did not hold its breath during this period. Medical emergencies could occur. Travel could become necessary. The family's existing legal entanglements, the claims from prior relationships, the disputes that had been managed but not resolved, the jurisdictions that had noted the family's assets without having been given cause to act on them, did not suspend their interest during the transition period. And a child with no legal identity, in an emergency that required engagement with state medical or administrative systems, created exactly the kind of record generation event the gap had been designed to prevent. Not through malice. Through the ordinary functioning of systems that process cases they have not been designed to handle by creating records that categorize the anomaly. The families who succeeded treated the transition period as the highest risk phase of the entire architecture. More exposure than the birth event. More exposure than the eventual identity acquisition. Because it was the phase in which the child was most legible to the systems most motivated to claim them, legible as an anomaly, as an uncategorized entity, as the kind of case that generates institutional interest precisely because it cannot be processed through normal channels. They managed it with the same obsessive attention to failure modes that they applied to the energy layer. Redundant contingency protocols. Pre-negotiated response pathways for every category of emergency that could force engagement with state systems. Identity documents prepared in advance that would function in emergency contexts without creating the permanent records that the gap was designed to avoid. Legal advisors in multiple jurisdictions pre-briefed, pre-retained, pre-authorized to act without the delay that a cold engagement would require. The transition period was not a gap in the architecture. It was the most densely engineered element of it. Hidden beneath the apparent simplicity of the Flag-State gap was a support structure that had taken, in the most sophisticated cases, years to build and test. The gambit looked elegant. Elegant things are usually expensive. There was a second element of the Flag-State gambit that received less attention in the internal discussions of the ultra-sovereign families, not because it was less important but because it was more difficult to discuss without sounding like something the families were not. The political dimension. The flag registry market existed because small nations needed revenue. The ultra-sovereign families needed the administrative properties of specific registry frameworks. This was, at the transaction level, a straightforward commercial relationship. But at the structural level, it was something more complicated. The families were, through their registry choices and their associated investments in the jurisdictions they selected, participants in the political economy of small state sovereignty. The microstate that amended its administrative code to create a birth registration pathway, with a non-operational submission destination, was not doing so in a vacuum. It was doing so because someone had identified that the amendment served a market need, had communicated this to the right administrative contacts, had, in some cases, provided the legal drafting, had, in some cases, provided the fee structures that made the amendment financially attractive to a parliament whose operating budget was measured in units that made the transaction meaningful. The families were not innocent bystanders to the legal landscape they were exploiting. They were, in a limited but real sense, its architects. Dario had raised this with the woman who had first briefed him on the project. Not as a moral objection, as a risk assessment. Political capital invested in a specific administrative configuration was political capital that could be recalled, redirected, or countered by a better capitalized interest. If the families were shaping the regulatory environment, someone could reshape it. The woman had listened to this with the flat empirical attention she brought to everything. Then she said, "That's why we don't rely on any single configuration, and why we invest in the stability of the jurisdictions we use, not just in the specific provisions we need." She meant this concretely. The families that used a microstates registry did not simply pay the registration fee and disappear. They invested in the jurisdiction's infrastructure. Not conspicuously, not in ways that created the kind of visible dependency that would make the jurisdiction's regulatory choices legible as captured, but sustainably, in ways that gave the jurisdiction reasons, economic, relational, reputational, to maintain the administrative configurations the families needed. Not because the jurisdiction was owned, because its interests over time had been quietly aligned. This was not bribery. It was the long-horizon version of the same principle that governed the rest of the stack. Do not rely on anyone's goodwill. Align their incentives with your requirements. And then you do not need goodwill. You have something more durable. Structural compatibility. The Flag-State Gambit was ultimately a story about what law was for. The standard account of law, the one that legal education transmitted with minor variations across jurisdictions and centuries, was that law was for protection, for the resolution of disputes by a disinterested authority, for the establishment of clear rules that all parties could rely on in structuring their affairs. This account was not false. It was incomplete. Law was also, as any serious study of its production would reveal, a product, drafted by people with interests, shaped by advocacy from parties who had the resources to engage with the drafting process, applied by institutions whose administrative capacity was itself a product of political decisions that reflected the interests of the parties who had the most influence over those decisions. Understanding law as a product did not make it illegitimate. It made it navigable. A product has a production process. A production process has participants. Participants have interests. Interests can be understood. And interests, once understood, can be engaged. The Flag-State Gambit was not a trick played on law. It was law engaged structurally, by parties who had taken the trouble to understand it at the level of its production rather than merely at the level of its application, who had mapped the surface rather than seeking the wall, who had found the geometry that redirected the claim, and positioned themselves and their children accordingly, not outside the law, in the space where one law's reach ended and another's had not yet begun. A space that the law, read carefully, had always contained, that most people had never looked for, because most people had been taught to live inside the wall. And walls, as any surface builder understood, were not built for the benefit of the people inside them. They were built for the convenience of the people who decided where the wall went. The ultra-sovereign families had decided not to let other people make that decision. They had looked at the surface, found the angle, built the geometry, and then they had gone further. Because the Flag-State Gambit solved the birth event. It did not solve the life. A life required a more complete jurisdictional architecture, one that addressed not just the origin point, but the ongoing condition of a person moving through a world of overlapping claims, competing authorities, and systems designed to locate value and extract it from whoever held still long enough to be processed. The gambit was the opening move. The following chapters were the game. The sovereignty dowry. Part 2, the jurisdictional plays. 7. The non-birth certificate. Gestational records as attack surfaces, and the clinics that understood this first. The birth certificate is not the first document. This is the thing almost no one considers because the birth certificate is the document that matters, the one that opens the subsequent files, the one that anchors the legal identity, the one whose absence or presence determines whether a person exists in the administrative sense. But the birth certificate is downstream. It is the output of a process that begins months earlier, in clinical environments that generate their own records, records that are older than the birth certificate, more granular than the birth certificate, and in many ways more revealing than the birth certificate, because they document not just the fact of existence but the conditions of its production. The gestational record is the attack surface that precedes the attack surface everyone is looking at. And the clinics that understood this first were not, in the main, the clinics that anyone in the conventional fertility industry paid attention to. They were small, deliberately small, located in jurisdictions chosen not for their permissiveness toward the procedures they offered. The procedures were, by the standards of the post-scarcity era, unremarkable, but for the specific properties of their medical records law. Because medical records law, in the majority of jurisdictions, was written for a world in which the primary concern was patient privacy from commercial entities. It was not written for a world in which the patient's primary concern was protecting the record from the patient's own family, or from the jurisdiction that would use the record to establish the patient's child's legal status, or from the secondary market analytics firms that had developed, with considerable ingenuity, methods for deriving genomic optimization parameters from gestational records that did not, on their face, contain genomic data at all. The gap between what the records law addressed and what the records actually enabled was wide enough to drive a clinical architecture through. The clinics that understood this built their operations inside the gap. A gestational record in its fullest form is a remarkable document. It begins before conception, with the screening and selection procedures that precede implantation, the hormonal protocols that prepare the gestational environment, the monitoring records that establish baseline parameters against which subsequent measurements will be compared. It continues through the pregnancy itself, a longitudinal series of measurements, each individually unremarkable, collectively constituting a detailed model of the developing person before they have developed enough to be a person in any legally operative sense. Fetal growth trajectories. Genetic screening outputs, not full sequencing necessarily, but enough loci to establish for anyone who knew how to read the data, whether optimization had occurred and, if so, in which domains and to what approximate degree. Maternal biomarker profiles that, processed through the right analytical framework, could reconstruct elements of the gestational environment that correlated with specific developmental outcomes. Pharmacological administration records. Physician notes, the most dangerous element of all, because physician notes were written in natural language, by humans who had been trained to document what they observed and what they inferred, and whose observations and inferences, in a sophisticated clinical context, contained exactly the kind of interpretive content that a skilled adversarial analyst could use to reconstruct decisions that had never been formally documented. The note that set fetal parameters tracking above expected range was not a statement about genomic optimization. It was a statement about fetal parameters. It was also, to the right reader, a statement about genomic optimization. The gap between what the note said and what the note revealed was not a gap that records privacy law had been written to close. It was a gap that the clinics that understood this had been designed to exploit. Not by generating false records. By generating records that contained exactly what they needed to contain for clinical purposes and nothing that they did not need to contain for any other purpose. The discipline was called minimum sufficient documentation. It was, in practice, an art form. The conventional fertility clinic generated records for two reasons. The first was clinical. The records supported the treating physician's ability to manage the case, identify complications, and make informed decisions as the pregnancy progressed. This reason was genuine and important and generated a specific category of documentation that could not be eliminated without compromising the clinical function. The second was institutional. The records supported the clinic's legal and regulatory compliance, its liability management, its quality assurance processes, its relationships with insurers and oversight bodies, and the various institutional actors whose cooperation the clinic needed to operate. This second category of documentation was also genuine and important. It was also, from the ultra-sovereign family's perspective, the category that needed to be designed with the same care applied to every other element of the stack. Because institutional documentation served the institution, and the institution's interests were not identical to the family's interests. The institution needed records that would protect it from liability if something went wrong. The family needed records that would not become weapons in the hands of parties who wished to make claims on the child. These requirements were partially aligned and partially in tension. A record that demonstrated the clinical basis for a specific decision protected the institution. The same record demonstrated that the decision had been made, and the fact that a decision had been made was, for the ultra-sovereign family, more information than any subsequent adversarial proceeding should have access to. The clinics that understood this had developed documentation protocols that satisfied the clinical function, satisfied the institutional compliance function, and simultaneously minimized the information density of the record as experienced by a reader who was not the treating physician. Not falsification. Not omission of clinically material information. Something more precise. The systematic elimination of interpretive content that exceeded clinical necessity. The physician who noted fetal parameters tracking above expected range was generating interpretive content. A minimum sufficient documentation protocol produced instead the raw measurement from which that interpretation derived, the specific parameter, the specific value, the specific date, without the interpretive layer that converted measurement into inference. The raw measurement was clinically sufficient. It was significantly less useful to the adversarial analyst, because the adversarial analyst's value was precisely in interpretation, in the capacity to derive from measurements the inferences that the treating physician had recorded directly. Removing the physician's recorded inferences did not prevent the adversarial analyst from deriving their own, but it removed one layer of redundant confirmation. It increased the analytical burden. It introduced uncertainty where certainty had been recorded, and uncertainty in a legal proceeding was the defender's most useful resource. The most sophisticated element of the clinical architecture was not the documentation protocol. It was the record storage framework. A minimum sufficient documentation protocol that produced records stored in a centralized, queryable system was a minimum sufficient documentation protocol that could be subpoenaed, breached, or accessed through the consent frameworks that Prodigy LLC and its competitors had embedded in their client agreements. The record that existed in a centralized system existed for everyone with sufficient legal standing or technical capability to reach it. The clinics that understood this had developed, over the decade preceding the post-scarcity era's peak, a record storage architecture that drew on the same distributed, cryptographically secured principles that the sovereign families were applying to their financial and identity assets. Records were not stored centrally. They were segmented. The clinical record, the minimum sufficient documentation, was stored in one location, under one access framework, controlled by one set of keys. The administrative record, the compliance documentation, the regulatory filings, the institutional records that the clinic needed to maintain its operating licenses, was stored separately, containing no reference to the clinical record's content beyond what the regulatory framework explicitly required. The genomic work where it occurred was stored in a third system, controlled by a separate set of keys, with no persistent link to either the clinical or administrative records beyond the procedure window itself. After the procedure window closed, the link dissolved. The three systems contained, individually, partial information. Together, they contained the complete record. But together was a condition that required simultaneous access to three separately controlled systems. Access that could not be compelled through a single legal proceeding in a single jurisdiction, because no single jurisdiction had standing over all three storage locations simultaneously. The adversary who wanted the complete record had to win three separate legal battles, in three separate jurisdictions, before the information in any one system could be combined with the information in the others to produce the complete picture. Most adversaries gave up before the first battle was complete, not because they lacked resources, because the cost-benefit calculation of the exercise, in the face of a target who had structured specifically to make the calculation unfavorable, produced a negative expected value that any rational actor would decline. The architecture did not make extraction impossible. It made extraction economically irrational, which, for practical purposes, was the same thing. The clinics that built this architecture were not, in the main, the clinics that had started with this intention. They had started as conventional fertility clinics, sophisticated, well-equipped, operating at the premium end of a market that had been transformed by the post-scarcity era's collapse of cost in adjacent domains. As the cost of genomic sequencing fell, as the cost of computational modeling fell, as the cost of the physical infrastructure supporting advanced fertility procedures fell, the competitive differentiation among premium clinics had shifted from technical capability toward something less tangible. Discretion. Not secrecy for its own sake. Secrecy was a claim that attracted scrutiny, because the question of what was being kept secret was itself an invitation to investigation. Discretion in the more precise sense, the systematic limitation of information generation to what was genuinely necessary for the clinical function, combined with the architectural protection of even that limited information against access by parties whose interests diverged from the client's. The clinics that had recognized this shift early had invested in it, had hired legal architects alongside clinical architects, had redesigned their documentation systems with the same rigor they applied to their laboratory protocols, had built, over years of careful iteration, a clinical offering whose primary value proposition was not the procedure. It was the absence of the record that followed the procedure. Miriam Adeyemi Castillo had run a conventional fertility clinic for 9 years before she understood what her most sophisticated clients were actually buying. She had thought they were buying outcomes. the genomic work, the trait optimization, the statistical modeling of embryo potential, the careful selection among viable candidates to maximize projected composite advantage. She had been wrong. Or not wrong, incomplete. They were buying outcomes, but outcomes was the secondary purchase. The primary purchase was the absence of the record that would follow the outcome into the world. She understood this during a consultation with a client who asked, 40 minutes into a discussion of embryo selection parameters, a question she had never been asked before. The client asked who had access to the consultation notes. Not the genomic data, that question she was asked regularly and had a well-developed answer for. The consultation notes. The record of what had been discussed in this room in this conversation, over the past 40 minutes. Miriam had answered honestly. The notes were stored in the clinic's electronic records system, accessible to the treating physicians and under specified circumstances including legal compulsion, to authorized third parties. The client was quiet for a moment. Then he asked whether the clinic had considered not taking consultation notes. Miriam had spent a long time thinking about that question. The clinical answer was that consultation notes served a function. They ensured continuity of care. They supported informed decision-making across a treatment process that might extend over months and involve multiple providers. The client had a response to this that she found she could not immediately dismiss. He said, "What if everything clinically necessary for continuity of care was communicated verbally between providers, and the written record contained only the measurements?" She thought about this. She said, "The regulatory framework requires documentation of the clinical reasoning." He said, "Does it? Or does it require documentation that supports the clinical reasoning? Those are different requirements." She thought about this for a longer time. Then she called the lawyer who handled the clinic's compliance matters and asked him to read the relevant regulatory statutes again, with the specific question of whether the requirement was for recorded reasoning or for recorded measurements. The answer, she discovered, was more interesting than she had anticipated. The regulatory framework, in the jurisdiction where her clinic operated, required documentation sufficient to support a retrospective review of clinical decision-making. It did not specify the form that documentation took. It did not require that the physician's interpretive reasoning be recorded in real time. It required that the record support the reconstruction of the clinical basis for decisions if a review became necessary. Raw measurements supported that reconstruction. They supported it differently than narrative notes, less efficiently, requiring more analytical work from any reviewer who needed to reconstruct the clinical logic. But they supported it. The requirement was satisfiable, with records that were significantly less useful to anyone who was not conducting a clinical review. Miriam spent the following year redesigning her clinic's documentation protocols. It was the most consequential year of her professional life. Not because of what she built, because of what she understood in the building of it, about what medicine had been producing unintentionally, as a byproduct of documentation practices designed for one purpose, that served entirely different purposes in the hands of parties whose interests she had never been asked to consider. The gestational record as a tax surface. She had been generating the attack surface for 9 years. She spent the rest of her career building something different. The clients who came to the clinics that understood this were not, as a category, the wealthiest clients in the fertility market. They were the most architecturally sophisticated. The distinction mattered. The wealthiest clients, the families who had purchased the highest-tier prodigy packages, who had engaged the most sophisticated genomic optimization services, who had invested most heavily in the biological layer of their children's advantage, tended to have generated through those engagements the richest records. Because the most sophisticated genomic work required the most detailed documentation. The consultations were longer. The modeling was more granular. The selection process involved more data points, more analytical iterations, more recorded decision-making that the clinical team needed to preserve for its own continuity of care purposes. The richest genomic optimization produced the richest record. The richest record produced the largest attack surface. The largest attack surface attracted the most sophisticated adversarial analysis. This was not a paradox. It was a straightforward consequence of treating the genomic layer as the only layer that mattered. The ultra-sovereign families who had built the complete stack understood that the genomic work and the clinical discretion had to be calibrated against each other. More genomic work required more clinical record. More clinical record required more architectural protection. More architectural protection had costs in time and money, in the complexity of the clinical relationships and the jurisdictional frameworks they required. At some level of genomic sophistication, the protection costs exceeded the genomic benefit. That was the crossing point again, the same crossing point that appeared in the analysis of the genome as one layer, expressed differently in the clinical context. The families who found it calibrated accordingly. The families who did not find it generated, in the process of optimizing their children's biological potential, a documentary record of that optimization that became, in due course, one of the primary vectors through which the optimization's value was extracted by parties who had contributed nothing to its creation. There was a category of gestational record that the clinics had not initially considered an attack surface because its content appeared entirely routine. The standard prenatal care record. Not the genomic work. Not the selection procedure. Not the optimization modeling. Just the ordinary longitudinal record of a pregnancy, the measurements taken at regular intervals, the routine screenings, the standard developmental assessments that any competent prenatal provider would conduct regardless of whether any optimization had occurred. The problem was what was absent. In an optimized pregnancy, the standard prenatal measurements track differently than in an unoptimized pregnancy. Not dramatically, the optimization was, in the serious cases, calibrated to remain within the range of natural variation. But within that range, the distribution of measurements over time had a characteristic shape that differed from the natural distribution in ways that were, to a trained eye, detectable. The absence of certain variance. The consistent tracking at specific points within the natural range rather than the more random distribution that natural processes produced. Not a signal that was present. A noise that was absent. The secondary market analytics firms had, by the time the ultra-sovereign families were engaging with this problem, developed models sophisticated enough to detect optimization from standard prenatal records with a reliability that exceeded most legal standards for inference. They did not need the genomic data. They did not need the selection records. They needed the standard measurements. And standard measurements were generated by every prenatal care provider who had ever seen the client. Not just the specialist clinic. The family physician. The urgent care visit at 12 weeks when a minor concern had required immediate attention. The specialist consultation in a second city when the primary provider was unavailable. Each routine contact generated a record. Each record contained measurements. Each set of measurements in an optimized pregnancy had the characteristic shape. The attack surface was not the specialist clinic's records. The attack surface was the totality of clinical contact across the gestational period. Managing it required not just the redesign of the specialist clinic's documentation practices. It required the management of all clinical contact, which meant pre-selecting the entire clinical ecosystem, every provider who might see the client during the gestational period, for the same minimum sufficient documentation discipline, which meant either limiting clinical contact to providers who operated under that discipline, or managing the documentation generated by providers who did not. Neither option was simple. Both were necessary. The families who understood this built what the advisors called a clinical envelope, a complete perimeter of documentation discipline providers around the gestational period, with no gaps through which an undisciplined record could be generated by a provider who had not been briefed on the framework. Building the clinical envelope required, in most cases, years of relationship development with providers in multiple specialties across multiple jurisdictions. It could not be assembled in response to a pregnancy. It had to be in place before the decision to proceed, which meant it was part of the pre-architecture, part of the stack that had to be built before the stack was needed. Another reason the serious cohort began planning years in advance. Not because the logistics required it, because the architecture did. Miriam Adeyemi Castillo met Dario Escobar-Men at a conference whose nominal subject was medical records law in cross-border clinical contexts. The conference was attended by approximately 40 people. None of them were there for the nominal subject. They were there because someone had identified, correctly, that the intersection of maritime jurisdiction and medical records law contained a specific and underexplored set of properties that were relevant to a specific and underserved client population. Miriam and Dario spent 3 hours in a conversation that began with the question of which jurisdiction's records law applied to a clinical record generated aboard a vessel in international waters, and ended somewhere considerably more interesting. The question was not purely theoretical. It had never been purely theoretical. The answer, as Dario mapped it across the relevant maritime conventions and the domestic record statutes of the major flag states, was that the applicable records law was, in the majority of cases, unclear. Not absent. Not deliberately gap-structured. Simply unclear, because the intersection of maritime jurisdiction and medical records law had never been a significant source of litigation, and statutes that are never litigated never develop the case law that clarifies their edges. Unclear law is, for the surface builder, useful law. Because unclear law means the claim, when it eventually arrives, will face a preliminary question about its own validity, about whether the authority asserting the claim has the jurisdictional standing to assert it, that must be resolved before the substantive question can be reached. Preliminary questions take time. Time is, in the context of a claim designed to extract value from a specific developmental window, the most effective defense available. A claim that cannot be resolved before the window closes is a claim that cannot extract the value it was designed to extract. The window closes. The value moves. The claim, when it finally achieves resolution, finds an empty room. Miriam understood this. She had spent a year redesigning her clinic's documentation protocols. She had not yet understood that the clinic's location was also a variable. Dario explained the flag-state properties of maritime medical practice. She listened with the particular quality of attention that physicians bring to information that reorganizes their existing model of a problem. Then she said, "How long would it take to make a vessel clinically functional at the level I would require?" Dario said that depended on what she required. She told him. He thought about it. He said, 2 years if the flag state selection is right. 18 months if we can accelerate the registry relationship. She said, "Start with the registry." The non-birth certificate was not a document. It was an architecture. A system of deliberate absences, records not generated, links not created, measurements recorded without the interpretive layer that made them legible to adversarial analysis, that produced, around the birth event and the gestational period preceding it, a documentary environment so minimal that the subsequent legal identity the child acquired through deliberate selection stood without the shadow of prior records complicating it. A person whose legal identity is not preceded by a documentary history is a person who arrives, in the administrative sense, fresh. Not without a past. With a past that belongs to them, that they can disclose or withhold, that no prior clinical engagement has already distributed across the systems of record that the extraction ecosystem queries as a matter of routine. The conventional child arrived with a file already open, already being read, already being modeled, before they were old enough to know that modeling was occurring. The child born through the clinical envelope arrived differently. The file was theirs, if it existed at all. The deepest argument for the non-birth certificate architecture was not strategic. It was philosophical, and it was one that Miriam Adeyemi Castillo made, in the years after she had built the clinical framework and watched the first cohort of children move through it, with a precision that surprised people who had initially categorized her as a technician rather than a thinker. She said, "The gestational record is the first story told about a person. It is told before they can tell their own story. It is told by people with their own interests in the telling, and it follows the person through every subsequent context in which they are required to account for themselves." She paused. That seems like the wrong starting position for a sovereign individual. Someone in the room asked, "But isn't the story true?" Miriam said, "All records are partial. The question is whose partiality gets recorded. The gestational record records the partiality of the institutional relationship, the measurements that matter to the institution, the interpretations that serve the institution's documentation needs, the inferences that protect the institution's liability position." She said, "We have simply asked a different question. What minimum record serves the clinical function? And then we have generated exactly that record. Nothing more. The person arrives with the minimum sufficient documentation of their origin, and the maximum possible space to define what that origin means. That space," she said, "is not a gap in their identity. It is the beginning of their sovereignty." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone asked the question that always came eventually. What if something goes wrong? What if they need the record later for medical reasons, for legal reasons, for reasons we haven't anticipated? Miriam had thought about this for a long time. She said, we hold it, not in a system, in a structure that the person themselves controls the key to. A majority, they receive the key. They decide what to do with what's inside. They decide whether to open the file, whether to show it to anyone, whether it is useful to them, or whether they prefer to begin from the position the architecture created. She said, the record exists. It is theirs, not the institutions, not the jurisdictions, not the families. There. That is the difference. That is what we built. Not the destruction of the record, the return of it, to the only person whose story it actually was. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 2, the jurisdictional plays. 8. Citizenship by design. When nationality is a portfolio decision, not an accident of geography. Nationality is the oldest assigned category. Older than class, which requires an economy to produce it. Older than profession, which requires a division of labor. Older than religion as an administrative identity, which requires an institution to confer it. Nationality, in its most primitive form, precedes all of these. It is simply the fact of having been born somewhere, among a people who recognized each other as belonging to the same somewhere, before the somewhere had borders or a flag or a parliament to make the belonging official. The official version came later. The passport, the certificate, the database entry that converted the biological fact of birth location into a legal status carrying specific rights, obligations, and the particular quality of claim that sovereign states make on the people they have decided to count as theirs. The claim is not uniform. Every nationality carries a different bundle of rights, obligations, and exposures, different tax treatment, different military obligation, different visa-free travel, different access to social infrastructure, different legal standing in different courts, different protection, or different vulnerability. When the state whose nationality you hold decides that its interests require actions that affect you personally. For most of human history, the bundle was not chosen. It was received. The accident of birth location determined the starting bundle, and the starting bundle was, in the majority of lives, the permanent bundle. Movement between bundles was possible but difficult, requiring emigration, naturalization processes of varying accessibility and duration, the renunciation of prior status in jurisdictions that did not permit dual nationality, and throughout all of it, a sustained engagement with bureaucratic systems that were not designed to facilitate the movement and were not motivated to accelerate it. The post-scarcity era changed the friction, not the principle. The principle that nationality was a bundle of rights, obligations, and exposures that could be evaluated, compared, and in some cases exchanged, had been understood by a specific cohort of wealthy families for generations. The wealthy have always understood nationality as more negotiable than the nationality's own officials preferred to acknowledge. They had purchased residency through investment programs. They had acquired second passports through ancestry programs in countries their grandparents had emigrated from. They had maintained domicile relationships with low-tax jurisdictions while retaining the social infrastructure of high-service ones. This was not new. What was new in the post-scarcity era was the sophistication of the framework, not the individual moves. The portfolio approach. A portfolio approach to nationality treats the bundle not as a single instrument to be held or exchanged, but as a collection of components to be distributed across multiple instruments, each optimized for the specific exposure it was selected to manage. Travel document. Selected for breadth of visa-free access and the diplomatic posture of the issuing state toward jurisdictions the holder expected to frequent. Tax residency. Selected for the interaction between the holder's asset profile and the jurisdiction's tax treatment of that specific asset profile. Not the lowest rate in the abstract, but the lowest effective rate on the specific income, capital gain, and inheritance categories the holder actually generated. Legal identity for asset holding. Selected for the property law framework, the enforcement of judgment architecture, the trust and foundation law, the specific interaction between the jurisdiction's legal framework and the frameworks of the other jurisdictions where assets were held. Social infrastructure access. Selected for the quality of medical, educational, and civic infrastructure the holder wished to be able to access, and the conditions under which access was available. Emergency standing. Selected for the diplomatic reach of the issuing state, the quality of its consular services in the regions where the holder spent time, the reliability of its willingness to act on behalf of its citizens when they encountered difficulty in foreign jurisdictions. Each component could be held through a different nationality or legal status. The portfolio was not a collection of countries. It was a collection of specific legal relationships, each selected for the function it performed in the holder's overall jurisdictional architecture. For the ultra-sovereign families, the portfolio approach extended to their children in ways that the conventional wealthy family's nationality planning did not reach. Because the conventional wealthy family planned nationality for themselves, the ultra-sovereign families planned it for a person who did not yet exist, whose needs they could anticipate in outline but not in detail, whose life would unfold in a world they could model probabilistically but not predict specifically. They were building a portfolio for a variable. The portfolio had to be flexible enough to accommodate the full range of futures the variable might produce. The planning horizon created a specific design problem. A nationality portfolio built for the needs of a 40-year-old in the present might be poorly calibrated for the needs of a 40-year-old 2 decades hence. The jurisdictions that were stable and well-governed today might not be stable and well-governed when the child needed them most. The tax frameworks that were favorable today might have been reformed by governments responding to political pressures that were already visible, but not yet decisive. The travel documents that provided broad access today might have accumulated the diplomatic friction of a deteriorating relationship between the issuing state and the states the holder would most need to enter. The ultra-sovereign families addressed this through 2 complementary strategies. The first was diversification across stability profiles. A portfolio that included only the most stable, long-established jurisdictions was a portfolio concentrated in a specific risk, the risk that stable, long-established jurisdictions would, as they had historically done at irregular but not unpredictable intervals, undergo political transformations that dramatically altered their relationship with the mobile wealthy. The French Revolution was a political transformation of this type. So was the English Civil War. So, in a considerably more bureaucratic register, was the wave of automatic exchange of information agreements that the major developed nations had implemented in the decades before the post-scarcity era, which had converted previously private offshore structures into transparently reported positions. The stable jurisdictions had done this. The stable jurisdictions would do it again. The portfolio that included only stable jurisdictions was concentrated in stable jurisdiction risk, which was real, even if it materialized slowly and with significant advance warning. The portfolio that included some less stable jurisdictions, selected for specific properties that were likely to persist even through political transitions, because they were embedded in the jurisdiction's economic self-interest, rather than in the preferences of any particular government, was more diversified across the full risk spectrum. The second strategy was optionality preservation. The child's portfolio was not built to be optimal for any specific anticipated future. It was built to preserve the maximum number of options across the widest range of futures. This was a different optimization objective than the one that governed conventional nationality planning, which sought the best current answer to a known set of requirements. The ultra-sovereign family's objective was to ensure that as the future revealed itself, as the world the child would actually inhabit became legible through the passage of time, the portfolio contained the raw material for adjustment. Relationships with jurisdictions that could be activated or deepened as circumstances required. Legal statuses that could be upgraded or transferred as the child's specific needs became clear. Connections to administrative systems whose cooperation could be obtained through the relationships the family had built, rather than through the cold application process that a stranger to those systems would face. The portfolio was not a fixed instrument. It was a dynamic relationship with a set of jurisdictions, maintained, cultivated, and adjusted over time in response to the actual world the child was navigating rather than the anticipated world the parents had modeled. The citizenship by investment programs that proliferated in the post-scarcity era were, from the ultra-sovereign perspective, a necessary but insufficient instrument. Necessary because they provided a legitimate pathway to acquire legal status in a chosen jurisdiction, legitimacy being a property that the families valued not for its own sake, but for the specific advantages it conferred in subsequent dealings with institutions that queried status before extending access. A legitimate citizenship was a citizenship that systems processed without generating the inquiries and flags that an unusual or questionable status triggered. Insufficient because the programs were designed for revenue, not for the specific calibration the families required. The Standard Citizenship by Investment program offered a standardized product, a passport from the issuing jurisdiction, visa-free access to a specified list of countries, the right to reside in the jurisdiction if the holder chose to exercise it, tax treatment according to the jurisdiction's standard framework. This was a package. The families did not want the package. They wanted specific components of the package combined with specific components from other jurisdictions' packages, assembled into a configuration that no standard program offered because no standard program had been designed for the specific configuration the family required. Achieving this required going beyond the program, beyond the standard investment threshold, the standard processing timeline, the standard due diligence framework, the standard output. It required building a genuine relationship with the jurisdiction, not with its citizenship program, which was an administrative function operating at the level of procedure, but with the jurisdiction's actual decision-making apparatus. With the people whose interests shaped what the jurisdiction did and whose cooperation could produce outcomes that the standard program could not. This was not bribery. The families were careful about this distinction, not primarily for ethical reasons, though some of them had ethical positions on the question, but for strategic ones. Bribery created a relationship of mutual vulnerability. The official who had been bribed held leverage over the party who had bribed them. That leverage was an attack surface, a point at which the architecture could be compromised through the ordinary human mechanisms of exposure, regret, or competing incentives. Relationship was different. A jurisdiction whose economic interests had been genuinely aligned with the family's presence, through investment that created employment, through infrastructure contribution that served the jurisdiction's development objectives, through the kind of sustained engagement that made the family a valuable partner rather than a transactional client. That jurisdiction had reasons to extend cooperation that did not depend on any individual official's discretion. The cooperation was structural. Structural cooperation, unlike individual cooperation, did not dissolve when the individual departed. It persisted through administrative transitions, through elections, through the ordinary churn of official personnel that characterized any functioning institution. The family that had built structural alignment with the jurisdiction had built something that would survive the tenure of any particular government. That was the investment horizon, not the term of the current administration, the generation. Valentina Reyes Okonkwo had spent 7 years building the jurisdictional portfolio before she fully understood what she was building. She had started, as most of the ultra-sovereign families started, with a conventional wealthy family's approach to the problem: offshore structures, investment programs, the standard toolkit that any competent private wealth advisor could assemble. She had recognized early that this toolkit was insufficient, not because it was poorly designed, because it had been designed for a threat model that did not match hers. The conventional wealthy family feared tax authorities. Valentina feared something more precise. She feared the moment when everything she had built, the clinical work, the intellectual property, the distributed asset structures, the relationships she had developed over 2 decades of operating at the intersection of genomic research and jurisdictional architecture, became legible to a system that would immediately begin calculating how to extract it. The tax authority was part of that system. It was not the whole system. The whole system included every institution, every legal framework, every family member with a potential claim, every market participant with an incentive to model her asset profile and identify the most productive point of access. She had mapped the system. She had identified its most active nodes. And she had concluded that the conventional toolkit addressed none of them with sufficient specificity. She began rebuilding. Not from scratch, the conventional structures provided useful components that she incorporated into the new architecture. But from a different design objective. Not tax minimization, claim minimization. The difference was significant. Tax minimization was a defensive strategy. It reduced a specific category of extraction, while leaving the overall claim surface largely intact. Claim minimization was a structural strategy. It reduced the total surface area across which any extraction mechanism could operate, accepting higher extraction in specific categories where the extraction was unavoidable in exchange for lower total exposure across the complete threat landscape. The portfolio she built over 7 years was optimized for claim minimization. The specific configuration Valentina arrived at was not reproducible by anyone without her specific combination of resources, relationships, and the 7 years of relationship building that had preceded it. This was, she had concluded, a feature rather than a limitation. A jurisdictional portfolio that could be replicated quickly and cheaply was a portfolio that would be replicated by parties with similar needs, similar resources, and an interest in the same jurisdictional properties. Replication concentrated demand. Concentrated demand attracted attention. Attention attracted the regulatory response that closed the specific gap the portfolio had been designed to exploit. The portfolios that persisted were the ones that were too specifically calibrated to the individual holder's circumstances to be attractive as a template. Not because they were secret, because they were singular. Hers involved 3 primary legal statuses across 3 jurisdictions, held through 4 different entity types, with a travel document from a 5th jurisdiction whose diplomatic relationships with the 3 primary jurisdictions were sufficiently distinctive to provide, at the intersection, a set of legal rights that no single jurisdiction's framework could have provided independently. She did not explain the full configuration to anyone. Not her legal advisors individually, each of them understood their component of the architecture without understanding the whole. Not her financial advisors, who saw the asset positions but not the legal structures that governed their transmission. Not her family, none of whom were in a position to benefit from understanding the architecture and several of whom were in a position to compromise it if they did. She held the complete picture herself. In her memory, not in any document, because a document was a record, and records were attack surfaces. The complete configuration existed in one place, her mind, which was, she had concluded, where the load-bearing layer of any sovereignty stack ultimately resided. Not in the legal structures, not in the jurisdictional relationships, not in the key architecture or the data hygiene or the clinical envelope. In the person who understood all of it simultaneously and could hold the complete picture under conditions of pressure, adversarial questioning, and the sustained uncertainty that being genuinely sovereign, genuinely outside the default systems, produced as an ambient condition of daily life. The portfolio was the external expression of an internal capacity. The internal capacity was the thing that could not be designed by an advisor, purchased from a program, or transmitted through a document. It had to be developed, which brought the portfolio question back, as all questions in the sovereignty stack eventually returned, to the epistemics. What kind of mind could hold this? Could navigate the complexity without simplifying it prematurely? Could maintain the configuration under pressure without reaching for the comfort of a simpler, more legible position? Could live in the gap, the productive, deliberately maintained gap between systems, without the anxiety that the gap produced in minds trained to find security in belonging clearly to something? This was the question Valentina was sitting with when she decided to have a child. Not whether she could provide the material conditions of a sovereign life. She could. Whether she could produce or create the conditions for the emergence of a mind that could inhabit it. Whether the epistemics endowment she could construct would develop, in the specific variable of the child she would have, the internal capacity the portfolio required. Whether sovereignty could be transmitted, or whether it had to be, in every generation, discovered. The portfolio she began building for her child was different from the portfolio she had built for herself. Not more conservative, more generative. Her own portfolio had been built reactively, in response to a threat model that had been identified through direct experience of the threats. Each component had been added in response to a specific vulnerability that she had either encountered or modeled with sufficient precision to treat as real. The child's portfolio was built prospectively, in response to a threat model that had to be constructed from principles rather than experience, because the child had no experience and the future the child would inhabit was not fully legible. The prospective portfolio emphasized optionality over optimization. It preserved relationships with a wider range of jurisdictions than her own portfolio required, because she could not know which relationships would be most valuable in the future she could not predict. It maintained legal statuses that had no immediate utility, because the cost of maintenance was low and the option value of having them available, if circumstances changed, was positive. It built connections at multiple levels of the jurisdictions it engaged, not just the administrative level at which transactions were processed, but the institutional level at which policy was shaped and the relational level at which discretion was exercised. Because discretion, the capacity of a human being in an official position to apply judgment rather than procedure, was the resource that mattered most when circumstances fell outside the anticipated range. And circumstances always fell outside the anticipated range. Eventually. Always. There was a conversation that Valentina had with the child, when the child was 11, that she returned to many times in subsequent years. Not because it was profound in its content, because of what it revealed about whether the transmission was occurring. They were in a city neither of them lived in, attending to a component of the portfolio that required periodic in-person engagement with a specific institutional relationship. The child knew in outline what they were doing and why. She had been raised with the stack explained in age-appropriate terms from the beginning, not as a set of rules to be followed but as a set of choices that had been made for specific reasons, which could be examined and questioned. She had been asking questions since she could form them. On this occasion, after a meeting that had lasted 3 hours and had involved a degree of relational navigation that Valentina had found more demanding than usual, the child asked a question that Valentina had not anticipated. She said, "Is it tiring? Living like this?" Valentina thought about this honestly. She said, "Sometimes. Less than the alternative." The child considered this. Then she said, "What's the alternative?" Valentina said, "Living in a system that was not designed with your interests in mind, and spending your energy accommodating its requirements." The child was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But we're always accommodating someone's requirements. Today we spent 3 hours accommodating his." She meant the official they had met with. Valentina looked at her daughter. She said, "Yes. We accommodated his requirements because doing so serves our interests. That's different from accommodating requirements that serve someone else's interests at the expense of yours." The child thought about this. She said, "How do you know the difference?" Valentina said, "You ask whose interests are being served. And by whom? And at what cost to whom?" She said, "You ask that question about every system you're inside. Including this one." The child looked at her. "Including the stack?" "Including the stack," Valentina said. She meant it. She watched her daughter absorb this, the explicit permission to examine the architecture that had been built around her, to apply to it the same structural literacy that she had been taught to apply to everything else. The child did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Okay. Just that. Okay." And returned to looking out the window at the city they were passing through. A city that did not know they were there. That had no record of their presence. That would have no claim on whatever they were building. Valentina watched her daughter watch the city. She thought, the transmission is occurring. Not the portfolio. The relationship to the portfolio. The capacity to hold it, examine it, find it wanting if it warranted finding wanting, and build something better if the finding required it. That was the citizenship by design finally understood. Not the passports. Not the legal statuses. Not the entity structures or the investment relationships or the carefully cultivated official connections. The mind that could manage all of it. Evaluate all of it. Revise all of it. Without losing the thread. Without reaching for the comfort of belonging clearly to something. Without mistaking the architecture for the person inside it. That mind. That was the jurisdiction that mattered. The one that no state could issue. No program could confer. No record could document. The internal sovereign. Whose nationality was their own. Designed by no one. Held by one person only. And transmitted, imperfectly, provisionally, with full acknowledgement that the transmission might produce something other than what was intended, through the slow, uncontrollable, sovereignty-resistant process of raising a child who could think. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 2, The Jurisdictional Plays. 9. The trust that holds nothing. Structures built to appear empty to every system that would compel disclosure. The most valuable trust in the world contains nothing. This is not a paradox. It is a design specification. The trust that holds assets holds them visibly, at least to the system sophisticated enough to look, and in the post-scarcity era, every system worth fearing had become sophisticated enough to look. The beneficial ownership registries that major financial jurisdictions had spent 2 decades constructing, the automatic information exchange frameworks that had converted previously opaque offshore structures into transparently reported positions, the computational tools that the secondary market analytics firms had developed for reconstructing asset positions from the fragments of information that leaked through even the most carefully designed structures. All of these had made the trust that held assets a trust whose assets were, in some meaningful sense, known to the tax authority, known to the litigation adversary with sufficient resources to pursue discovery across multiple jurisdictions, known to the family member with a potential claim who had retained advisors whose entire practice was identifying and reaching assets that their holders believed were protected, known, most dangerously, to the extraction ecosystem that had developed in the post-scarcity era specifically to model the asset positions of the ultra-sovereign class and identify the most productive points of access. The trust that appeared to hold nothing could not be reached by any of these systems. Not because the systems lacked sophistication, because there was nothing visible to reach. The assets existed. They were real, productive, and generating returns. They simply did not exist in the trust. They existed in the relationship the trust had with other structures, relationships that were legally operative but documentarily minimal, that produced effects in the world without producing records of those effects in any system that the adversarial analyst could query. The trust was the frame. The artwork was elsewhere. And the relationship between frame and artwork was recorded, where it was recorded at all, in forms that required the simultaneous resolution of multiple jurisdictional questions before they could be read as a relationship. Trust law is among the oldest bodies of legal doctrine still in active operational use. Its origins are medieval, in the specific problem created by crusading knights who needed to transfer their lands to a trusted party during their absence without triggering the feudal incidents of tenure that a formal ownership transfer would have generated. The solution was elegant in its period and has proven extraordinarily durable across the centuries. The legal ownership of an asset is separated from its beneficial ownership. The trustee holds the legal title, is, in the eyes of the law, the owner. The beneficiary holds the beneficial interest, is, in the eyes of equity, the person for whose benefit the asset is held. This separation created, from its medieval inception, a structure that sat uncomfortably across the categories that law normally used to organize property relationships. Who owned the asset? The trustee legally, the beneficiary beneficially, and the tension between those two answers, the productive ambiguity that equity courts had spent centuries calibrating, remained the trust's most useful property in the hands of people who understood it architecturally rather than merely instrumentally. Because tension between legal and beneficial ownership was tension between two systems. And tension between systems creates gaps. And gaps, as the surface builders understood, were where sovereignty was maintained. The conventional trust structure that the wealthy had used for generations as a tax and estate planning vehicle was, by the standards of the post-scarcity era, transparent. Not because the beneficial ownership registries had made it transparent, though they had helped, but because the structure had been designed for concealment from a specific and limited set of adversaries operating with limited analytical tools, and the adversaries had upgraded their tools while the structures had remained largely unchanged. The conventional offshore trust, settled in a favorable jurisdiction, with a professional trustee, holding investment assets that generated taxable returns in the settler's home jurisdiction, was visible to any analyst who knew where to look. The beneficial ownership was nominally concealed. The economic substance was not. The assets generated returns. Returns were paid somewhere. The somewhere left traces. The traces accumulated and correlated across sufficient data sources, reconstructed the position with a reliability that the structure's designers had never anticipated because they had designed against the analytical tools of their own era, rather than against the analytical tools of the era their structures would operate in. The ultra-sovereign families had recognized this dynamic and responded to it, not by finding better concealment. Concealment was a losing strategy in an environment of improving analytical tools, but by redesigning the structure from the objective function downward. The objective was not concealment. The objective was claim minimization. Concealment and claim minimization were related but distinct objectives. Concealment sought to prevent the adversary from knowing an asset existed. Claim minimization sought to ensure that the adversary's knowledge of the asset's existence did not translate into a legally actionable claim on it. These were different problems with different solutions. Concealment failed when the adversary's analytical capability exceeded the structure's opacity. Claim minimization failed only when the adversary obtained the legal standing, in the right jurisdiction, with the right procedural tools at the right time, to convert knowledge into a valid claim. The analytical capability threshold was falling. The legal standing threshold was not. Because legal standing required more than information. It required jurisdiction. And jurisdiction, as the families had learned, was the variable they could actually control. The trust that held nothing was built around a specific jurisdictional property. In most common law jurisdictions, a trust was subject to disclosure obligations in proportion to the jurisdictional connection between the trust and the disclosing authority. A trust settled in jurisdiction A with a trustee in jurisdiction B, holding assets in jurisdiction C, for a beneficiary in jurisdiction D, was subject to the disclosure requirements of all four jurisdictions, but only to the extent that each jurisdiction's framework applied to its specific element of the trust. Jurisdiction A's trust law governed the trust's internal mechanics. Jurisdiction B's trustee regulation governed the trustee's obligations. Jurisdiction C's property law governed the assets. Jurisdiction D's tax law governed the beneficiary's treatment of distributions. No single jurisdiction had complete visibility. Each jurisdiction's disclosure obligation applied to a component. The complete picture required assembling the components from four separate disclosure regimes, each with its own standards, its own thresholds, its own enforcement capacity, its own relationship to the other three. The assembly was possible. It was expensive, slow, and required a level of interjurisdictional coordination that the adversarial analyst could rarely achieve without the active cooperation of multiple sovereign authorities simultaneously. Sovereign authorities rarely cooperated simultaneously. They had their own procedural requirements, their own political considerations, their own backlogs and resource constraints and interagency tensions. The trust that exploited this distributed disclosure landscape did not eliminate the adversary's information. It increased the cost of assembling it to actionable form. Cost is the claim minimizer's most effective tool. Because no adversary has infinite resources. At some cost threshold, the expected value of the adversarial action, the value of what would be extracted, discounted by the probability of successful extraction, fell below the cost of the action itself. Below that threshold, rational adversaries withdrew. The trust that held nothing was calibrated to place the cost threshold above the expected value of extraction. Not infinitely above it. That would require infinite complexity, which had its own costs. Sufficiently above it that the rational adversary found better uses for their resources. The structure that the most sophisticated families employed was not a single trust. It was a trust network, a set of interrelated entities whose relationships with each other were legally operative but documentarily attenuated, distributed across jurisdictions in a configuration that required navigating multiple disclosure regimes simultaneously to reconstruct the network's actual economic architecture. The centerpiece of the network was the trust that held nothing. A trust settled in a jurisdiction chosen for the specific properties of its trust law, specifically for the provisions governing what the trustee was required to disclose and to whom, and under what conditions those provisions could be limited by the trust deed itself. Several jurisdictions had, by the post-scarcity era, developed trust law frameworks that permitted the trust deed to limit or modify the trustee's disclosure obligations in ways that the major financial centers' trust law did not permit. These were not tax havens in the conventional sense. Some of them had relatively ordinary tax treatment. They were disclosure architecture jurisdictions, places where the trust deed could instruct the trustee to limit disclosure to specified categories of beneficiary, to delay disclosure under specified conditions, to hold certain information in a sealed letter of wishes that the trustee was obligated to maintain, but not to disclose except under conditions defined in the deed itself. The trust settled in such a jurisdiction, with appropriate deed provisions, was a trust whose internal mechanics were legally opaque to the disclosure regimes of every other jurisdiction in the network. Not because it concealed anything that those jurisdictions required to know. because it was structured to ensure that what those jurisdictions required to know about it was, technically and accurately, nothing. The trust held no assets. Assets were held elsewhere, in structures whose connection to the trust was established through private arrangements that fell outside the categories that the disclosure regimes were designed to capture. The trust's visible function was the management of a limited set of administrative relationships, none of which generated the kind of economic activity that disclosure regimes were designed to identify and report. The trust appeared empty because, from the perspective of every system that would compel disclosure, it was empty. The value was in the relationships. And relationships, unlike assets, were extraordinarily difficult to compel disclosure of. Ezekiel Fontaine Park had been a trust and estates attorney for 22 years before he began working with the ultra-sovereign families. His prior practice had been technically sophisticated. He had structured complex multi-jurisdictional trust arrangements for wealthy clients across 4 continents, had navigated the successive waves of automatic information exchange implementation that had progressively reduced the opacity of the structures he built, and had developed, through this experience, a detailed understanding of exactly how each successive transparency initiative had failed to capture what it had intended to capture. Not because the initiatives were poorly designed, because the gap between what the initiative was designed to capture and what it actually captured was always shaped by the same political economy. The initiative was designed by representatives of the jurisdictions that had the most to gain from transparency, the large high-tax nations whose residents were using offshore structures to reduce their domestic tax obligations. The initiative's design reflected those jurisdictions' analytical frameworks built around the categories of structure and relationship that their own legal systems recognized and could process. The structures that fell outside those categories fell outside the initiative, not because the drafters had overlooked them, because the drafters' analytical frameworks did not contain them. You cannot regulate what your framework cannot see. Ezekiel had spent 22 years learning in precise detail what each successive transparency initiative's framework could and could not see. The families who came to him came because they had identified, correctly, that this knowledge was the most valuable thing he possessed. Not the legal drafting skill, not the jurisdictional relationships, the map of the analytical frameworks and their limits. He gave them what they needed, not the structure, the design objective behind the structure, the specific articulation of what the structure needed to achieve, in terms of what it needed to be visible as, and what it needed to be invisible to before any drafting occurred. Because drafting without design objective produced structures that looked sophisticated and functioned inadequately. The sophisticated-looking structure that failed to achieve claim minimization was worse than no structure at all. It had cost resources to build. It had created records of its construction. It had established a posture, sophisticated, deliberate, clearly intentional, that adversarial analysts read as evidence of valuable assets worth reaching, which increased rather than decreased the investigative attention directed at the structure's holder. The structure that achieved claim minimization was often, in its external appearance, unremarkable. Not simple. Simplicity in complex jurisdictional environments was usually achieved through oversimplification, which created gaps of a different kind. But unremarkable, the kind of arrangement that, on cursory inspection, generated no flags, that appeared to any system performing a routine scan to be exactly what it claimed to be, which was, in the trust that held nothing worth reaching. The relationship between the trust that held nothing and the assets it was architecturally connected to was maintained through a specific set of instruments that Ezekiel had spent years developing across multiple jurisdictions. None of them were novel in themselves. Trust law, private international law, and the law of contract had all, across their long histories, developed instruments for establishing legally operative relationships between entities without creating the documentary record that conventional property transfer generated. Letters of wishes, memoranda of understanding, side letters, oral instructions evidenced only by the conduct of the parties, private arrangements that were legally binding under the law of the jurisdiction whose law governed them, but whose existence was not required to be disclosed to any other jurisdiction, because no element of the arrangement fell within any other jurisdiction's disclosure perimeter. The instruments were individually unremarkable. Their combination, in the specific configuration that the architecture required, was the art. because the configuration had to satisfy a set of constraints that pulled against each other. The arrangement had to be legally operative, it had to actually work, had to actually establish the relationship between the trust and the assets that the architecture required, had to actually produce the economic effects that the structure was designed to produce. A structure that was legally impotent was a structure that provided the costs of complexity without the benefits of protection. The arrangement also had to be documentarily minimal. The record of the arrangement's existence had to be as attenuated as the legal function permitted, and the record of its content had to be held in a form accessible only to the parties whose cooperation was required for its operation. And the arrangement had to be durable. It had to survive the passage of time, the changes in personnel, the evolution of the jurisdictional frameworks within which it operated, and the death or incapacity of the parties who had established it, without requiring the kind of formal documentation that durability normally required. These constraints were in tension. Legal operativeness pushed toward documentation. Courts prefer documented arrangements because undocumented arrangements are harder to enforce. Documentary minimalism pushed away from documentation. Records were attack surfaces. Durability pushed toward formalization. Informal arrangements depended on the continued cooperation of parties who might become unavailable or unwilling. The structure that satisfied all three constraints simultaneously was the product of design that held the tensions consciously rather than resolving them prematurely in favor of anyone. Ezekiel had learned, through the specific failures of structures that had resolved the tensions prematurely, exactly where each resolution produced which failure mode. The structure that prioritized legal operativeness over documentary minimalism produced a well-functioning arrangement that could be reached. The structure that prioritized documentary minimalism over legal operativeness produced a well-concealed arrangement that did not function. The structure that prioritized durability over the other two produced a formal arrangement that survived but was visible. The structure that held all three simultaneously was rare. It was what the families paid for. The child's relationship to the trust that held nothing was the most delicate element of the architecture. Because the trust's claim minimization function depended on the child's legal relationship to the trust being, from the perspective of every system that would compel disclosure, minimal. A child who was clearly identified as a beneficiary of the trust was a child whose relationship to whatever assets the trust was architecturally connected to could be inferred. The inference might not be provable, but inference did not need to be proven to generate adversarial attention. It needed only to be plausible enough to motivate the investigation that would attempt to convert inference into proof. An investigation, even unsuccessful investigation, was expensive. It consumed the child's resources, time, and attention. It generated records of its own, records of the investigation's existence, of the questions that had been asked, of the positions that had been taken in response. Records that future adversaries could use as a map of where to look. The architecture the families built for their children's relationship to the trust network was therefore not a relationship in the conventional legal sense, not a named beneficiary status, not a documented interest, not a recorded entitlement. It was a relationship of potential. The capacity to benefit from the network under specified conditions, established through arrangements that existed in forms that the disclosure regimes of the relevant jurisdictions were not designed to capture, documented only where documentation was legally necessary, and in forms that were inaccessible to any party who was not party to the arrangement itself. The child was not in the trust. The child was in the relationship between the trust and the conditions that would activate the child's access to it. The conditions existed. The access was real. The relationship was operative. The documentation was minimal. The adversary who looked at the trust saw nothing worth reaching. The adversary who looked at the child saw nothing connected to the trust. The connection existed in the gap between the two observations, in the relationship that neither observation captured, in the space between the frame and the artwork, where, as always, the valuable things resided. Valentina Rez Okonkwo had a conversation with Ezekiel that she returned to for years afterward. They were reviewing the architecture for her daughter's relationship to the network, the third such review in 2 years, because the network was a living structure that required maintenance, adjustment, and periodic reassessment as the jurisdictional environment evolved. Ezekiel had identified a specific element of the arrangement that had, since their last review, become slightly more visible than the architecture required, Not through any failure of design but through a regulatory development in one of the peripheral jurisdictions that had narrowed a gap they had relied on. The gap was not closed. It was narrower. Narrower was manageable. But it required adjustment. Valentina had reviewed the proposed adjustment and approved it. Then she had asked a question she had not asked before. She said, when she is old enough to understand this fully, all of it, the complete architecture, will she be able to manage it herself? Ezekiel thought about this honestly. He said, the technical management, yes. The documentation is designed to be self-explanatory to someone with the right background, and she will have the right background. He paused. The relational management is different. The relationships with the jurisdictions, with the trustees, with the advisors who hold the components, those are human relationships. They require ongoing cultivation. They degrade without attention. They cannot be automated. Valentina said, so she will need people. Ezekiel said, she will need people she has chosen, who have aligned interests, and whose alignment she maintains actively. He said, that is the irreducible human element. The architecture reduces the dependence on people whose interests may not align. It does not eliminate dependence on people. It shifts it toward people whose cooperation serves the architecture's objectives. Valentina said, and if her judgment about those people is wrong? Ezekiel said, then she pays for the error. As you have paid for the errors in your judgment about people. As everyone pays. He said, the architecture reduces the cost of those errors. It provides recovery pathways. It limits the damage any single error can do. He said, it does not make her immune to human misjudgment. Nothing does. He paused. The mistake would be to build an architecture so resistant to human dependence that it becomes resistant to human operation. A structure that requires no trust in anyone requires no one, and a structure that requires no one is a structure no one maintains. And unmaintained structures decay. He said, the trust that holds nothing because someone is actively ensuring it holds nothing. That is not a passive state. It is a maintained condition. Valentina looked at him. She said, so the architecture depends on her. He said, everything depends on her. The architecture makes her dependence on others structural rather than accidental. But her dependence on herself, on her own judgment, her own maintenance, her own willingness to do the work, that is irreducible. He said, that is why the epistemics matter more than the structure. A person who understands the architecture can maintain it. A person who has merely inherited it cannot. He said, you are not building a trust for her. He said, you are building the conditions in which she becomes the person who can build her own. Valentina sat with this. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary way, ordinary people inside ordinary systems, processing the claims those systems made on them with the ordinary mixture of compliance and resistance that ordinary life required. Inside the room, two people were discussing the architecture of a different kind of life. One built in the gaps between those ordinary systems, maintained by the active attention of a person who understood the gaps as the load-bearing structure, rather than as the empty space. Who knew that the trust held nothing, and that the nothing was the point. Not emptiness. Not absence. Potential held in reserve. Available when needed. Invisible until then. To everything that would claim it. Visible only to the person who held the key. Who knew what was there. Because they had built it. Because they had maintained it. Because they understood that sovereignty was not a structure you received. It was a condition you produced. Daily. Through the active, unglamorous, technically demanding work of ensuring that the gap between the systems remained a gap. That the frame remained distinct from the artwork. That the trust that held nothing continued to hold nothing. While everything it was connected to continued to grow. Quietly. In the space between observations. Where the valuable things had always lived. The sovereignty dowry. Part 2, the jurisdictional plays. 10. The protocol of stateless kinship. Multi-jurisdictional family networks with no single node of legal vulnerability. The family is the original network. Before corporations, before states, before the legal architectures that the post-scarcity era produced to manage the interaction between them, there was the family. A distributed set of individuals connected by shared biological origin, and more practically, by the mutual obligations that shared origin generated. The family network allocated resources, managed risk, transmitted knowledge, enforced contracts in environments where no external enforcement mechanism existed, and provided the redundancy that ensured the network's continuity when individual nodes failed. It was, in the language of systems design, robust. Robust because it was distributed. Distributed because distribution was the only architecture available, in a world where centralization required infrastructure that pre-modern societies could not maintain. Then the state arrived. And the state, recognizing the family as both a useful administrative unit and a potential competitor to its own authority, did what states do with useful competitors. It absorbed it, not by force primarily, by definition. The state defined what a family was, which relationships generated legally recognized kinship, which kinship generated legally recognized obligation, which obligation generated legally recognized claim. It registered births, licensed marriages, recorded deaths, administered estates, adjudicated disputes between family members using frameworks the state had designed. In doing so, it converted the family from a sovereign network into a legible administrative category. Legible to the state, manageable by the state, available to the state as a transmission mechanism for its own objectives, tax obligations that flowed through inheritance, military service that flowed through citizenship by blood, social obligations that flowed through the legal definition of dependency. The family remained a network. But it had become a network whose architecture was defined by an external authority, whose interests were not identical to the network's own. The ultra-sovereign families had recognized this as the deepest jurisdictional problem they faced. Not the tax treatment, not the disclosure obligations, not the specific provisions of inheritance law in any particular jurisdiction. The foundational problem, that the family, as a legal category, had been designed by the state for the state's purposes. And they were trying to build something that served different purposes entirely. The protocol of stateless kinship was not a legal document. It was a design philosophy, expressed in practice through a set of structural choices about how the network was configured, how its nodes related to each other, and how the network as a whole related to the external systems that would inevitably seek to claim, define, or adjudicate it. The central design principle was the one that had governed the rest of the sovereignty stack. No single point of failure. In network architecture, a single point of failure is a node whose loss or compromise causes the entire network to fail. Robust networks are designed to eliminate single points of failure through redundancy, multiple paths between any two nodes, multiple nodes performing any critical function, distributed storage of critical information so that no single node's loss renders the information inaccessible. The family, as the state had defined it, was full of single points of failure. The marriage was a single point of failure, a legal relationship between two individuals that concentrated enormous jurisdictional exposure at a single node, subject to adjudication by a single authority, vulnerable to the full range of pressures that a concentrated legal relationship enabled. The primary residence was a single point of failure, a jurisdictional anchor that determined tax treatment, legal standing, and the applicable framework for resolving disputes across the full range of a person's legal relationships. The will was a single point of failure, a document that concentrated the entire question of estate transmission in a single instrument, subject to contest in a single proceeding, vulnerable to the legal standing claims of every party whose relationship to the decedent the state had recognized. The named beneficiary was a single point of failure, a person whose identity was known, whose relationship to the estate was documented, and who therefore became the target of every adversarial effort to intercept the transmission. The protocol of stateless kinship eliminated each of these single points of failure. Not by eliminating the underlying relationships, by refusing to allow the state's definition of those relationships to be the architecture's load-bearing element. Kinship in the protocol was functional rather than legal. Not defined by blood necessarily, though blood was one source of the commitment and mutual obligation that functional kinship required. Not defined by ceremony, though ceremony served functions within the network that were unrelated to the legal status it nominally conferred. Not defined by residence, though shared residence created certain practical efficiencies that the network took advantage of where the jurisdictional exposure it created was manageable. Defined by demonstrated alignment of long-horizon interest. by the sustained, verifiable, behaviorally evidenced fact of caring about the network's continuity more than about any individual's short-term advantage at the network's expense. This was a more demanding definition than the state's. The state recognized kinship instantly, at the moment of biological connection or legal ceremony, and maintained that recognition indefinitely regardless of subsequent behavior. The protocol recognized kinship provisionally, subject to ongoing demonstration of the behavioral evidence that functional kinship required. A family member who acted against the network's interests did not lose their biological connection. They lost their position in the network's architecture. Access to the key structures was modified. The trust relationships that determined information flow were adjusted. The jurisdictional coverage that the network provided was withdrawn from the elements of the person's affairs that the network had been sheltering. Not as punishment, as the logical consequence of a network design that could not afford to maintain vulnerable nodes in positions of structural significance. The protocol was not cruel. It was architectural. Cruelty implies a judgment about the person. The protocol made no judgment about the person. It made a judgment about the node. The configuration of the network across jurisdictions was the protocol's most complex engineering challenge. Because the benefits of jurisdictional distribution, the elimination of single points of legal claim, the multiplication of the cost of adversarial analysis, the preservation of optionality across the full range of futures the network might navigate, had to be balanced against the costs of that distribution. Communication costs. The difficulty of maintaining genuine relational connection across multiple jurisdictions, time zones, legal frameworks, and the inevitable divergence of daily context that physical separation produced. Coordination costs. The difficulty of making decisions that required the network's collective judgment when the nodes were distributed across environments that made synchronous consultation difficult and asynchronous consultation vulnerable to the delays that adversarial timing could exploit. Trust maintenance costs. The difficulty of maintaining the behavioral evidence of functional kinship across the distance and reduced contact frequency that jurisdictional distribution required. These costs were real. The families that managed them well had developed, over years of careful iteration, a set of practices that were not reducible to protocol. They were culture. The specific texture of how the network communicated, made decisions, maintained connection, and transmitted the shared understanding of why the architecture existed and what it was for. All of this was transmitted not through documents but through practice. Through the specific rhythms of contact that kept the network coherent without concentrating it. Through the decision-making norms that allowed action without requiring consensus on every element. Through the conflict resolution practices that addressed the inevitable tensions between nodes, whose daily contexts had diverged without allowing those tensions to become the single points of failure that adversaries could exploit. The culture was the most important element of the protocol, and the most difficult to design, because culture could not be designed directly. It could only be created through the sustained practice of the behaviors that produced it. The network's relationship to legal kinship was strategic, rather than adversarial. This distinction mattered. The ultra-sovereign families did not reject legal kinship as a category. They refused to allow legal kinship to be the primary architecture. Where legal kinship served the network's interests, where the legal definition of a relationship produced specific rights or protections that the network wanted to be able to access, they used it. Where legal kinship created vulnerabilities, where the legal definition of a relationship produced claims, obligations, or exposures that the network wanted to avoid, they structured around it. The same relationship could be legally recognized in one jurisdiction and legally non-existent in another. The network used both characterizations depending on which was needed in which context. A relationship legally recognized in jurisdiction, A provided access to A's family protection frameworks when the network needed them. The same relationship's legal non-existence in jurisdiction, B provided insulation from B's inheritance and claim frameworks when the network needed that instead. The relationship was real. Its legal characterization was variable, and the variability was a resource. The treatment of children within the protocol required the most careful calibration. Because children occupied a unique position in the network's architecture. They were, simultaneously, the network's most important long-horizon investment and its most significant short-horizon vulnerability. Most important long-horizon investment. The network's continuity depended on the next generation's capacity to understand, maintain, and eventually extend the architecture. Without heirs who possessed the full epistemics of the network's design, who understood not just its current configuration but the principles that had produced that configuration and would need to produce future reconfigurations, the network would degrade across a generation. Most significant short-horizon vulnerability. Children were, in the legal frameworks of virtually every jurisdiction, the category of person most subject to state protection that was also state claim. Child welfare frameworks gave states broad authority to intervene in the circumstances of minors. That authority was in the hands of a state acting in good faith toward the child's welfare, a genuine protection. In the hands of a state acting on behalf of an adversarial party who had identified the child as a lever for reaching the network's assets, it was an extraordinarily powerful instrument of extraction. The protocol addressed this by separating the child's relationship to the network from the child's relationship to any specific jurisdiction's legal framework, as completely as the architecture permitted. The child was not, in any jurisdiction's official records, identified as a member of the network in a way that would trigger the child welfare authority's interest in the network's affairs. The child's legal identity was held in a jurisdiction selected for the specific properties of its child welfare framework, specifically for the narrowness of that framework's definition of the circumstances that would trigger intervention, and the robustness of its framework for parental authority against third-party claims. The child's actual circumstances, the offshore platform, the distributed educational environment, the multi-jurisdictional movement pattern, were not voluntarily disclosed to any authority that had not established a legal basis for requiring disclosure. And the legal basis for requiring disclosure were, through the jurisdictional architecture, structured to be difficult to establish simultaneously across multiple relevant jurisdictions. The child was protected, not by the state, by the network. And the network's protection was, in the assessment of the families who had built it, more reliable than the state's, because the network's interests were aligned with the child's interests in a way that no state's interests were guaranteed to be. Nikolai Vasadiemi had grown up inside the protocol. He had not known it by that name. The families did not give it a name, because name things attracted questions about their nature and their purpose, and the protocol's nature and purpose were not topics the network shared with people who had not earned the context to understand them. He had known it as the way things were. As the specific texture of his life that differed from the lives of the children he occasionally encountered in conventional educational settings, children whose parents knew where they lived, whose jurisdictions knew who they were, whose families operated within the ordinary visible architecture of legal kinship and all its attendant claims. He had found those children when he was young slightly baffling, not inferior, not to be pitied, simply legible in a way he was not, arranged in categories that the surrounding systems could process without friction. He was not in those categories. He moved through the systems the way water moved through terrain that had not been designed to channel it, not blocked, not constrained, but not directed either, finding its own path, taking the route that the terrain's actual geometry offered rather than the route that the terrain's designers had anticipated. He understood by the time he was 14 that his life was architecturally unusual in ways that had specific strategic significance. By 16, he understood most of the architecture's design logic. By 18, he could have reproduced it from first principles. He had not been taught it. He had assembled it from observation, from watching the adults around him navigate the systems they moved through, from asking questions that were answered with the careful completeness that the protocol's epistemics tradition required, from the specific problems he had been given to work on that were, he understood in retrospect, calibrated to develop precisely the understanding he would need. He was, at 22, a node in the network. Not a peripheral node. A node whose position in the architecture was load-bearing in ways he had earned rather than inherited. He had not been given the position. He had been given the conditions in which he could develop the capacity the position required. Then he had developed it. Then the network had adjusted its architecture to reflect what he had become. That was the protocol's transmission mechanism, not the documentation of a position, the creation of the conditions for a person to earn one. The protocol's most significant departure from conventional family architecture was its treatment of conflict. Conventional family conflict, the disputes between relatives over inheritance, over the interpretation of a parent's wishes, over the allocation of resources within the network, was adjudicated by the state. Courts. Probate proceedings. Family law frameworks that gave external authorities the power to resolve internal disputes through the application of external standards. The protocol refused this adjudication. Not because it expected the network to be conflict-free, it did not, and the families who had designed it were specific about their expectation that conflict would occur. Because external adjudication of internal conflict was the single most reliable mechanism through which state claim reached into the network's architecture. A probate proceeding was not just a dispute resolution mechanism. It was a disclosure event. It required the production of documents that the network had carefully avoided producing. It required the assertion of positions about asset ownership, about the relationships between entities, about the nature of the arrangements that govern the network's economic architecture, that, once asserted in a public proceeding, became permanent records. It required the network to become legible to the adjudicating authority. And legibility, as the protocol understood it, was the precondition of claim. The protocol therefore required that internal conflict be resolved internally, through mechanisms that the network had designed, that the network controlled, and that did not produce the disclosure events that external adjudication required. This was not arbitration in the conventional sense. Arbitration was itself a legal framework, with its own disclosure requirements and its own relationship to the court systems that the protocol was trying to avoid. It was something older. A council. A structured conversation among the network's senior nodes, governed by norms that the network had developed through practice, producing decisions that were binding not because any external authority would enforce them, but because the network's members had chosen to make them binding through their own conduct. The binding force was not legal. It was relational. The member who defied the council's decision did not face a court. They faced the network's adjustment of its architecture in response to their defiance. Access withdrawn. Coverage removed. Position in the structure revised to reflect the demonstrated misalignment between the members' interests and the network's. This was, in the experience of the families who had operated it across a generation, sufficient. Not perfectly sufficient. The protocol was not perfectly sufficient at anything, but sufficient in the sense that the expected cost of defiance exceeded the expected benefit often enough that defiance was rare, and when it occurred it was managed through the internal mechanisms without generating the external disclosure events that would have compromised the architecture for everyone. The question that skeptics raised most consistently about the protocol of stateless kinship was the question of what held it together. If the binding force was relational rather than legal, what prevented the relationships from fraying? What prevented a member whose immediate interests diverged from the network's from simply withdrawing, from choosing the legible life, the conventional jurisdiction, the ordinary legal kinship that the state was prepared to recognize and the social world was prepared to accommodate? The families had different answers. Some emphasized the epistemics, the formation of minds that found the network's architecture not a burden but a natural expression of how they understood the world to work, such that the conventional alternative appeared not comforting but constricting. Some emphasized the material, the specific resources and protections the network provided that were not available outside it, and that created genuine long-horizon incentives for maintaining the relationships that the network required. Some emphasized the cultural, the specific texture of belonging that the network created, which was different from the belonging that conventional social structures provided but was, for the people who had grown up inside it, more real. None of these were fully satisfying answers. None of them were intended to be, because the question itself was built on an assumption the protocol rejected. The assumption that networks require something external to hold them together. A legal framework. An enforcement mechanism. A power outside the network that could compel the behavior the network required. The protocol's position was different. Networks held together because their members found them worth maintaining. When they stopped finding them worth maintaining, they did not hold together. No legal framework prevented this. Legal frameworks slowed it. They created friction around the exit. They imposed costs on departure that sometimes exceeded the benefit of departure, and therefore produced continued membership that was not freely chosen. The protocol was not interested in membership that was not freely chosen. It was interested in membership that was freely chosen because the network was worth belonging to. Because the architecture it provided was genuinely superior, for the specific people it served, to the alternatives available. Because the relationships it required were genuinely valued, by the people who had earned them, as the most substantive relationships in their lives. If the network stopped being worth belonging to, if the architecture degraded, if the relationship soured, if the alternatives available outside improved to the point where the network's advantages no longer exceeded its costs, then members would leave. And the protocol's designers had built into the architecture from the beginning the recognition that this was possible. Not as a failure mode to be prevented. As the ultimate test of whether what had been built was worth building. A network that people freely chose to maintain was a network worth maintaining. A network that required coercion, legal, social, or relational, to retain its members was a network that had already failed at the thing that mattered most. Nikolai Vasadiemi thought about this often. Not anxiously. With the quality of attention he brought to complex systems whose behavior over long time horizons was not fully predictable from their current parameters. He was a node. A load-bearing one. He had not been coerced into this position. He had developed toward it through the conditions the network had created and his own choices within those conditions. He found the network worth maintaining. Not primarily because of what it provided him materially, though it provided him considerably. Because of what it required of him. The network required that he maintain, actively and continuously, the quality of relationship and judgment and structural understanding that his position in it demanded. It required that he hold complexity without simplifying it prematurely. That he maintain the gap between systems without reaching for the comfort of belonging clearly to one. That he think about every claim the world made on him, the question the protocol had transmitted as its deepest instruction. Whose interest does this serve? And at what cost to whom? He asked this about external systems. He asked it about the network itself. He asked it about his own position within the network. He asked it, with the particular discomfort that genuine intellectual honesty required, about the decisions the network's founders had made on his behalf before he existed to make decisions for himself. Some of those decisions he endorsed. Some he would have made differently. He said so. The network adjusted. Not immediately. Not without friction. But it adjusted. Because a network that could not incorporate the informed dissent of its own well-functioning nodes was a network that had calcified, that had converted, through the accumulation of unexamined assumptions, from a living system into a fixed structure. Fixed structures did not adapt. Fixed structures under sufficient pressure broke. The protocol was designed to prevent this by building into the network, from the beginning, the capacity to hear its own critique. To be examined by the minds it had produced. To be found wanting and to adjust accordingly. To survive the verdict of the people who knew it best. That was the final test. Not whether the trust held nothing. Not whether the birth had occurred outside every registry. Not whether the jurisdictions had been selected with sufficient sophistication to place the cost of adversarial analysis above the expected value of extraction. Whether the people inside the architecture chose to remain inside it. Freely. Having examined it with the full analytical capacity the network had developed in them. Having understood its costs and its benefits and its failures and its genuine achievements. Having compared it to the alternatives they could see clearly because the epistemics endowment had given them eyes to see clearly. And having chosen this, not because they had been given no other option, because they had been given every option, and this was the one that made sense. To minds that had been built to find the things that made sense, and to build from what they found something better than what they had inherited, which was, in the end, the only inheritance worth transmitting. Not the trust, not the portfolio, not the Flag-State Gambit or the clinical envelope, or the multi-jurisdictional key architecture. The capacity to understand why those things existed. And the freedom to decide what to replace them with. When the time came. When the world had changed enough that the current architecture was no longer the right answer. When the next generation of sovereign minds looked at what their parents had built and said, with the flat empirical honesty of people who had been raised to prefer accuracy to comfort. This was good. We can do better. And then did. End of Part 2. The jurisdictional plays. Next, Part 3, the epistemic inheritance. What the sovereign parent teaches and refuses to. Companion volume Prodigy LLC. mxdm.substack.com/p/prodigy-llc the gene bank and post. Prodigy LLC, the gene bank in post scarcity. Scarcity becomes you. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1MPXMPFCJVMX SBPQVRWLUC5 or with fiat at PayPal, me/Martin Chartrand. Subscribe now.
The sovereignty dowry. When the genome is the deed and jurisdiction is the vault.
Listen via The Sovereignty Dowry Part 1. When the genome is the deed and the jurisdiction is the vault. May 3, 2026. Companion volume to Prodigy LLC.
In the post-scarcity era, rarity is you. When everything is free, your genome is the only asset that remains.
C. Not anomalous. Unlocatable. The system cannot optimize what it cannot find. Stay stateless. Pirate first. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Architecture of Bequest. What the ultra-sovereign gave their children instead of money. 1. The inheritance problem when the estate is a liability and the family is the threat. 2. The sovereignty stack data, keys, energy, jurisdiction in that order, always in that order. 3. Born offshore, the first generation engineered to arrive in no registry, under no flag, in no system's default. 4. The genome as one layer, why the families who only bought Prodigy packages left half the work undone. 5. The epistemics endowment, not what to think. How to build the tools that generate thought. Part 2, the jurisdictional plays. How sovereignty is architected before the child draws first breath. 6. The Flag-State Gambit, Microstates, Maritime platforms, and the art of choosing which law applies before the courts can choose for you. 7. The non-birth certificate gestational records as attack surfaces, and the clinics that understood this first. 8. Citizenship by design, when nationality is a portfolio decision, not an accident of geography. 9. The trust that holds nothing, structures built to appear empty to every system that would compel disclosure. 10. The protocol of stateless kinship, multi-jurisdictional family networks with no single node of legal vulnerability. Part 3, the epistemic inheritance. What the sovereign parent teaches and refuses to. 11. The curriculum that isn't one, why the children of the sovereign class were handed problems, not answers. 12. Robot stewards and the absence of doctrine, when the guardian's only hard-coded instruction is, surface, do not prescribe. 13. Proof of competence over proof of blood, inheritance gated not by birth order, but by demonstrated function. 14. The code base is patrimony, handing a child an uncompiled system instead of a will. 15. Forking the philosophy, what happens when the heir finds a bug in the parent's worldview, and is right. Part 4, the failures. Sovereignty attempted and lost, and why. 16. The single point they forgot, every architecture has one. The families who found theirs too late. 17. The heir who wanted a country on the children who traded stateless freedom for legible belonging. 18. The marriage vulnerability, how one transfer protocol undid 3 generations of jurisdictional engineering. 19. The jurisdiction that pivoted when the microstate you incorporated your children into changed the law, and you were too distributed to respond. 20. When optimization ate sovereignty, the families who over-indexed on genetics and underbuilt the legal moat. Part 5, the unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 21. Born in no record, a child with no genomic certificate, no birth jurisdiction, no proof of intent filing, and what that made possible. 22. The distributed cohort, simultaneous heirs across non-aligned families, the multi-sig bloodline in practice. 23. What Prodigy's engine couldn't find, not an anomaly, an absence, the asset that resists monetization by refusing to appear in the dataset. 24. Sovereignty as inheritance, the final gift is not wealth, not genetics, not even a code base. It is the structural conditions under which a human being cannot be reduced to a claim. Epilogue, the dowry letter. What one sovereign parent wrote, encrypted and time-locked for their heir's 30th birthday. Appendix. On the difference between a vault and a protocol, for those still deciding which to build. The Sovereignty Dowry is not against Prodigy LLC. It is what Prodigy's best clients were doing while Prodigy's engineers optimized the genome. Evolution doesn't optimize for profit. Sovereignty doesn't optimize for legibility. Burn the will. Ship the protocol. Pirate first. Recent episodes. The Great Bounce. April 30th. Sovereign by Design. April. Hyperreality races Deleuze. April. Hyperreality is infrastructure. April 27th. Marcado. Reclamado. Repropuesto. April 25th. MX. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. April 24th. MX. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes, a series by Pirate First. April 23rd. Super Earth, Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. April 22nd. Copyright 2026 MXTM and Vitsueke Martin Chartrand.
The Great Bounce. Is Alphabet facing a digital rebellion? The Great
Bounce, or how your inbox became a toll booth.
April 30th, 2026. Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. There's a quiet violence happening in the pipes. No explosions. No headlines screaming loud enough. Just silence. Emails that never arrive. Messages that dissolve mid-flight. Entire conversations evaporating like humidity over the Yucatan stone. You send. They never receive. Welcome to the Great Bounce.
The structure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption issues regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention. Signal integrity is failing.
We have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
4-2.
The one a post-K transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Martin Chartrand. Subscribe. Short post. They built a system that profits when you're gone. So don't leave them anything to inherit. Build what can't be owned. Ship what can't be seized. Pirate first.
I mean,
Hashtag.
we all use the same tech infrastructure now.
Exactly. And we are just replacing the old cognitive hierarchy of human managers with a new, much less transparent hierarchy of algorithmic filtering. If a redundant worker is told, hey, your life's meaning will now be negotiated by a black box AI in the shadow of a billionaire's real estate project, they aren't going to see a metabolic center for future validation. They are going to see a gilded cage.
Hashtag Pirate First, hashtag MXTM, hashtag Sovereign Stack, hashtag Build in Public, hashtag Decentralization, hashtag Exit the System, hashtag Protocol Not People, hashtag Digital Sovereignty, hashtag Future of Work, hashtag Creator Economy, hashtag Cryptoculture, hashtag Seasteading, hashtag AI Revolution, hashtag Post Scarcity, hashtag On Your Keys, hashtag Think Different. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res tax. Recent episodes. Hyperreality races Deleuze. Hyperreality is infrastructure. Marcado. Reclamado. Repropuesto. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes, a series by Pirate First. Super Earth. Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. Super Earth. Age of the Apes teaser. Introduction. The 1% plus debate.
They control the narrative now, hiding deep within the anomaly. But the story is the territory, and soon...
A hidden longevity civilization beneath the Grand Mayan aquifer seeds, a successor species engineered for extreme worlds.
Every system failed at night, so we built with bone and might.
We chose not to return.
So we built. You can follow the flame or remain what you were. Just a different time
We are crossing the threshold of civilizational inversion, where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role.
Proof of personhood, the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network.
The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Conclusion at the end of the anonymous web. As we stand in late January 2026, OpenAI's humans-only network remains a tantalizing, yet polarizing, leaked blueprint.
Subscribe.
Shadow fame spreads without permission.
X Prize. Start building, man.
Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed.